Welcome back to the GDFL podcast, everyone, hosted by yours truly, Andrew Korn. This week, I'm going to be doing another solo show, and starting next week, we'll have Mark joining, and then there's a few other guests scheduled to sign up for the next few weeks. Just wanted to do one more solo show. I have a topic at the end that pertains more so to myself than anyone else, so that's kind of why I'm doing this one of the solo show this week instead of recruiting another guest to join. Big week in GDFL action. I'm going to go through each of these games and do a bit of a quick rundown. So the first one on my list here is Logan beating me 156 to 130. And as you may recall, last week on the podcast, I told Logan I would give him a 60-point spread. Turns out I was the one who needed the 60-point spread. So what exactly happened in this matchup? Uh, on my side of it, I mean, I scored what my average has been the last 2 years, like my season average has been pretty much exactly 130, both in 2024 and 2023. My team took care of business and did what it needed to do. I mean, I could have gotten better games from David Montgomery and Devontae Smith, but otherwise, I felt like my team put up a satisfactory performance. The big shock is what happened with Logan's team. Logan had four players score at least 25 points, and then Brock Purdy also had a game of 17. Both Jordan Love and Josh Jacobs just absolutely popped off against the Cowboys, going for nearly 30 each. Justice Hill had a huge game scoring 26. Kenneth Gainwell had a huge day scoring 24. Really not a whole lot you can do about that. I mean, Logan just put up his best effort of the season. The previous 2 weeks combined, he had scored a combined, I think, 125-ish points. So for him to exceed that in 1 week is truly impressive. Hats off to you, Logan. You beat me fair and square. It just kind of sucks because this was one of those games you kind of pencil as a free win on your schedule, and I don't have that. But is what it is. You can only control who you play. And this week I played Logan, and he happened to have the second highest score of the week. Uh, yeah, that's about how that went. Next up, I am talking about Stun and Jake. Stun's team is still rolling. The team's looking pretty damn good. I would have it as one of the favorites to win the league this year. If I were to do a new power rankings, he'd definitely be in my top two. Yeah, Pickens is popping off without CD Lamb. It's really like the big thing of note here. So that's been good for Stun. For Jake, okay, I don't even know if I mentioned the score. If it was 143 for Stun and 91 for Jake. For Jake, uh, it's not really looking all that promising for the Bengals offense right now. And for someone who relies quite a bit on Jamar Chase, I'm sure that's got to be pretty discouraging. He's been off to a pretty horrific start without Joe Burrow. And we'll see if that is able to be recovered by the end of the year. Otherwise, it might end up being a longer season for Jake than I initially thought it would be. Alvin Kamara's also been pretty meh with the Saints this year, although the Saints offense isn't particularly good. And then Daniel Jones has cooled off a little bit since his hot start. So big week for Jacob coming. See if he can right the ship. But yeah, he's currently sitting at 0-4. Up next, we have Shrew and Ryan, where Ryan beat Shrew 125 to 110. For Ryan, I made it known before the season. I thought his flexes were a little iffy, and that, I mean, his quarterback room was obviously strong. Turns out at the start of the year, it's actually been the exact opposite. His flexes have been carrying his team with some pretty weak quarterback play. Jake Browning contributed almost nothing, but Odunze, Buka, and QJ just keep on scoring touchdowns for Ryan, and it's been going pretty well for him as he's 4-0. As for Shrew, it's got to be disappointing to see another loss in the column. You lose, uh, not that you lose. AJ Browning is continuing his disappointing start. Same with Devontae Smith on my team. That Eagles passing game just looks incredibly anemic right now. All you can really do is hope that that turns around. And then the other one is Brock Bowers is off to a slow start. I know he's coming off that knee injury to start the season, and so maybe he's not 100%. That explains some of his slow start. Maybe some of it's a Geno Smith chemistry issue, but Brock Bowers hasn't been who he was built up to be going into the season. Next matchup here, we have Sokol versus Beans, where Sokol wins 140 to 121. And for Sokol, Amon-Ra and Etienne just keep on balling. He really didn't have any duds in his lineup this week. It was just a pretty good week for Sokol overall. And then for Beans, same thing when I talked about with Jake's team, where this Bengals offense just looks ugly. It's looking pretty ugly for T. Higgins and Chase Brown right now. I think the best thing that we can hope for if the Bengals is that they trade for either Russell Wilson or Jameis Winston or someone like that to try and help turn the season around for the Bengals offense because it looks pretty pathetic right now, to say the least. The other thing I want to know with Beans is he questionably started Terry McLaurin after he was ruled out. So I'm wondering what Beans was thinking there starting him, but that kind of is what it is. Uh, Next matchup we have on here is Levi versus Mark, where Levi beat Mark 131 to 125.6. Levi had a Monday Night Miracle, and it's the second time in 2 years where Levi's had late scores to upset Mark. Yeah, this Levi's touch, or not Levi, Bo Nix's touchdown pass to RJ Harvey late in the game is what gave Levi the win overall. Other notes I have on Levi's team is Quinshon Judkins looks legit. I was at that Lions-Browns game, and he actually was running the ball pretty well against the ferocious Lions defensive line. So Quinshon Judkins could be the real deal. Levi might have gotten a steal with him in the draft. And then the other thing I want to point out was Romeo Doubs had 3 touchdowns. Absolutely monster game for Romeo Doubs. Best game he's had all season. That's really what helps propel him with victory over Mark. And then for Mark, it's just been a season of disappointment for him. He's had pretty horrible lineup efficiency to start the year. He's been operating at about a 70% lineup efficiency. I mean, this week he had Woody Marks, DK Metcalf, and Debo Samuel all on his bench. And then Lad McConkey and Derrick Henry continue to disappoint. Like, I wonder if it's getting to a point where Mark's actually benching Lad, which is seems crazy to think of considering he was a redraft top 12 receiver going into the season. The one thing I will say that Mark did right was he did start Carson Wentz over Michael Penix or Tua this week. But he did do something right. And then lastly, we have Trevor beating Chaz 160 to 108. Trevor's the top scorer this week. Genti and Bucky Irving were both pretty good. Really not a whole lot to say. Trevor's team is rolling. Like I said earlier, if I were to make a power rankings of my top 2 teams, Trevor and Stone would definitely be 1, 2 in some order right now. Both those teams are rolling. And then for Chaz, Geno Smith had another pretty lackluster performance, and he's had a bit of a turnover case going into the season. Not going into the season. So far this season, he's not been particularly great. The thing what's encouraging is Chris Godwin had 10 targets in his first game back with the Bucks. But yeah, Chaz's team is incredibly wounded right now, which was something I was talking about going into the season. Was Chaz's team was injured going into the season, and would his team be able to overcome those injuries? Yeah, right now, I mean Tyreek Hill's out for the year now. CeeDee Lamb's still out. Jaden Reed is out. Jalen Warren missed this past week. Just really rough go for Chaz on the injury front. And then taking a look at the standings, we have Ryan at first and 4-0. Trevor, Stun, Chaz, and myself are all 3-1. Sokol and Levi are both 2-2. Bean, Shrew, and Mark and Logan are 1-3, and then Jake is 0-4. A few things I want to call out the standings is Ryan right now is seventh in scoring, but just happens to be in first. A lot of that is because he only has 367 points against. So the average threshold Ryan is needed for a win this year has only been 92 points. Where if you compare that to Jake, who's in last, Jake has needed 147 points a week to get a win. So that's just been the way the schedule's gone this year. It's been in Ryan's favor and been against Jake. Uh, that's really the big one of note that I wanted to call out. A bit of a news and injury report. Malik Neighbors is now out for the season with a torn ACL and meniscus. Going to be out all this year, but he tore it early enough in the season where I think he should be able to make a full recovery for the start of next season. Tyreek Hill had a pretty gruesome knee injury on Monday Night Football. Have to wonder if that's going to be a career ender. He said he wants to try and come back from it, but I just really wonder if he'll be the same type of player coming back. We'll see if he's able to recover. I saw some reports that he might need multiple surgeries on that knee to get it squared. So. It's a shame. Tyreek Hill in his prime was one of the best fantasy players that we've seen in our generation. Um, Hopefully, he can have a speedy recovery, though he's not necessarily that great of a person. Not quite Deshaun Watson level bad, but I'm just going to leave it at that. Uh, next on the list I want to talk about was Lamar Jackson. It looks like he's going to be out a few weeks with a hamstring strain. Considering they have a week 7 bye, I'm expecting him to be out both weeks 5 and 6, and then come back healthy week 8. Beans will have to rely on his other quarterbacks to help get him through while Lamar is out. Cooper Rush is the starter. I saw his projection on Sleeper was 9.5 for this week, which is honestly kind of pathetic for a starting quarterback. We'll see if anyone trades for Cooper Rush. I think Stun had him last I checked. Other injury I want to talk about was Bucky Irving. Bucky Irving is expected to be out. I mean, I think it was week to week is what Todd Bowles said. Hold on, I'm pretty sure Todd Bowles is pretty unreliable with injury reporting, considering he said Chris Godwin was going to be back for the playoffs last year. And he missed the start of this season, so I'm not really sure how much I would trust what he has to say. I know Bucky Irving was in a walking boot and crutches, so I'm expecting him to be out at least this week, which means it should be a good week for Rashad White. We have a whole host of 49ers that are going to be out for Thursday night football tomorrow night, or it's going to be tonight because I'm going to be uploading this in the morning. Yeah, Brock Purdy, Ricky Pearsall, and Jawan Jennings are all out. The 49ers are pretty much going to be Mac Jones, CMC, and a dream. I think Kendrick Bourne and Sky Moore might be their leading receivers tonight. We will see what happens with the 49ers. Uh, yeah, it gives Logan one less quarterback for this week. Ricky Pearsall is a flex option for uh, Trevor that he's not going to have, and Juwan Jennings could have been a flex for sure this week that he's also not going to have. And then we have Jalen Warren, who missed this past week with a knee injury in Ireland. He might, I don't really, haven't really seen a ton on what his injury status is. He might be back for the next game. Might have just been a 1 week wonder that he was out, but something to monitor. And then lastly, I have three players who were recently added to IR. We have Trey Benson, Braylon Allen, and Cedric Tillman. Trey Benson's the big one here. He was going to be one of Ryan's starting running backs. He had his 8 carries last week and is now landed on IR. So in back-to-back weeks, we have seen James Conner and Trey Benson go down in the Cardinals' backfield. Next man up looked to be Michael Carter and Amari DiMercato. I foolishly dropped Amari DiMercato 2 weeks ago. I was looking at RB depth charts. Chris Brooks was running as the number 2 in Green Bay, so I dropped DiMercato because he was the 3 in Arizona to pick up Chris Brooks, who was the 2 at the time. Looks like Emmanuel Wilson has taken that number 2 job from him. Shrew was able to get Amari DiMercato after James Conner was ruled out for the season. Shrew was able to get him off of waivers. We'll see who picks up Michael Carter. I'm hoping it's myself, but as of the recording of this, I actually don't know who will be getting him. Braylon Allen's out. I think that's going to be good for Breece Hall the next few weeks while he's out on IR. His goal line fumble also, I think, was good for Breece Hall just because it won't be losing goal line touches to Braylon Allen anymore. And then lastly, Cedric Tillman's going on IR. Mostly just a depth piece for Stun, but maybe Jerry Jeudy has a bigger role, or maybe a lot of those rookie pass catchers in Cleveland might be breaking out with Isaiah Bond and Harold Fannin. One more piece of news that I didn't include on here that I wanted to mention is Dylan Gabriel's now starting for Joe Flacco in Cleveland. So we'll see how it goes for Dylan Gabriel. The big thing that happened today, this actually is why I actually recorded a podcast Tuesday night and was going to release it this morning. But after I saw this trade, I decided to postpone that because we have a blockbuster, one of the biggest trades this league has seen. Shrew has received Malik Neighbors and Trevor's 2026 first in exchange for Puka Nacua. I was stunned when I saw this. In my recording of the previous podcast, I had mentioned I wonder if Trevor's going to hold on to Neighbors or if he's going to make a more serious push for it because I do think his team's very good. Well, it turns out my question was answered within a few hours of me recording that podcast because Trevor is all in on this season. Puka is currently the wide receiver 1 by a pretty wide margin this year. So absolutely massive get for Trevor. He now has that Puka Stafford stack that Shrew had for the previous 2 years. And yeah, absolutely huge deal. What are the implications of this? I mean, obviously Trevor's pretty all in. I mean, most of the league seems to view it as a win-win. Handful of us think Trevor's the winner, getting an immediate contribution, while Shrew has neighbors in the 26 first. I will say this does help Shrew if he wants to tank this year. I think he's starting to lean in that direction. I want to say he was third in max PF when I was making this. I'll have to double check that. I think the draft order is coming up here in a second. But yeah, big move for Shrew. Think he's headed towards a rebuilding year, retooling year to help position himself better for next year. Uh, yeah, I mean, I think Neighbors will come back healthy at the beginning of next year, and Neighbors looks like an absolute stud before his injury. So definitely a blockbuster. Kudos to Trevor for making this. I did not see this coming when I saw that pop up this morning when I saw a trade was accepted. I thought it was going to be Levi trading Zay Flowers. I know he's been on the trade block. Yeah, absolutely big trade. I hope it works out for both of you, though I really hope it actually doesn't work out for either of you because I'm a competitor. Looking at the draft order, so Logan currently has the first and second picks. Shrew has the third pick, although I think trading away Puka is going to help his tank. Actually, I needed to update this because now Shrew has what's projected to be the 11th pick from Trevor. So Shrews now has a rooting interest against Trevor this year. Yeah, it's going to be, again, I'm not going to read too much into the draft order now, but definitely big things are happening with trades going on right now. And then I'll look ahead for next week. I haven't updated this since I pulled it on Tuesday. I'm taking on Ryan. It's going to be a pretty big matchup. I originally thought it was going to be a matchup of undefeateds, but Logan spoiled that for me. Should be a pretty good matchup. I think Jaden Daniels should be back for Ryan this week. I think he'll be a full go. So yeah, hoping it'll be a good matchup between the two of us. We have Stun versus Beans. Beans is going to have a bit of a hard time this week, I think, because Bijan. Oh, I mentioned my matchup with Ryan. Both Swift and Adunze are out this week, which would be some small blows for him. With Trevor and or not Trevor, with Stun and Beans, Stun's going to be operating at pretty much full strength. Beans is without Bijan this week, so it might be a bit of a tougher week for Beans. Already mentioned that Lamar's probably out. So it's going to be an uphill road for Beans, I think, to beat Stun this week. Up next, we have Shrew and Mark. This matchup just got a hell of a lot easier for Mark now that Shrew doesn't have Puka. Shrew doesn't have a QB2 this week with Caleb on his bye. With Mark, he's going to be benching. He doesn't have DK Metcalf or Drake London, but I'm expecting Mark to win this one pretty handily now that Shrew has traded away Puka. Next, we have Sokol and Chaz. Sokol is slightly favored to win this one. I don't think Sokol is missing anyone of note. And everyone I think Chaz is missing is already injured, so I don't think that one's going to be a huge deal. Next, we have Levi versus Logan. Uh, what's crazy is, I mean, Levi, I'm looking at Levi's roster. Levi's really not missing anyone too important. I guess Romeo Dobbs will be out. But Logan's gonna, I think, have by far the lowest projection in league history this week because Brock Purdy was just ruled out. Jordan Love and Josh Jacobs are on a bye. Kenneth Gainwell is on a bye. Logan doesn't have a quarterback this week, and I don't think he's gonna have a single player projected over 10 points in the starting lineup. I think Logan's gonna have what I expect to be the lowest scoring week in league history, following up what he just did last week against me. We'll see if I'm wrong. I could be wrong again, but I am expecting absolutely nothing out of Logan's team this week. He hasn't updated his lineup. His current projection is only 32 points, but with adding four players into his lineup, I really don't. And looking at who's available, he can start. I mean, I think his projection is about to be under 50 points. Levi's projection's 91 as of it's about 6 o'clock on Wednesday night. There's a lot of teams that have a higher total projection than I think what these two are going to be at combined. Yeah, going to be a great week for Levi to be playing Logan apparently. And then lastly, we have Trevor versus Jake. As I mentioned earlier, Trevor has the blockbuster where he lands Puka. The projection for this one's actually closer than I thought. Trevor is supposed to win about 134 to 125 as of now. Trevor's really not missing anyone of note on his lineup, and neither is Jake. Will be a massive week for Jake to be able to turn it around. This is the only 0-4 team in the league. And now for the special topic, I'm just going to be talking about my best ball portfolio. So I started doing underdog best ball drafts last summer, enjoyed it quite a bit, and started to keep doing it again this summer. So I'm going to just be talking about what best ball is, my approach and strategy, and then look at some of the top players that I drafted this year. This is the main reason why I actually wanted to re-record this podcast was I did this segment and just realized I was just naming off players. It really didn't seem like it was going to be that engaging to listen to for you guys. So I decided, let's re-record this. Let's start again and do it right this time. So what is best ball? So best ball tournaments are a fantasy football format where participants draft a team for the season with no in-season management. Instead, the site automatically sets the highest scoring lineup from the drafted players each week. So on Underdog, it's a one QB league. You have one quarterback, two running backs, three receivers, a tight end, and a flex. And then so that's I think eight starters that I just named. And then you have 18-man rosters. So some common best ball strategies are you want to choose upside over consistency. So you really want to go after those boom bust receivers and a lot of those guys who make the big play. Those are usually I'm usually more okay of targeting those type of players over someone who's consistent week to week because like you want to capture those spike weeks where players pop off. Another common best ball strategy that I do is I capitalize on draft value. So what I mean by that is if there's a player who's falling by ADP, I'll draft that player for a unique build. When a player is falling by ADP, like let's say that I take the player, I have the 48th pick and I take the player whose ADP was 34th. There's probably going to be very few teams that have that exact build as me. And so that's something I would do often is if a player was falling, I would just take them just to make sure that I can differentiate myself from other teams in these tournaments. Big one is quarterback, receiver, and quarterback tight end stacking, which I feel like is obvious. You want upside over consistency. So if a wide receiver has a big week, that quarterback has a big week. And then same philosophy goes for quarterback, tight end. You really want to prioritize drafting stacks because that's usually how you win, and especially in the playoffs in a best ball format. Another big one is a week 17 correlation. You want to target teams who play each other in week 17, who you're both expecting to have a high-powered offense in hopes that there's a high-scoring game and that there's high-scoring fantasy performances from those players. A good example of this was last year when the Lions played the 49ers in week 17. A lot of times when I would draft teams with Lions players, I would also target 49ers players in hopes that that game would end up being really high scoring. And that game did end up being really high scoring. I think it was 40 to 34 was the final score of that game last year. Something else people will do will find games that correlate in week 15 or 16. And just to, again, be a little more unique than the teams that are going after that week 17 correlation, which are what a lot of people do. This is one I didn't necessarily engage in as much this year. But last year, I pretty much had the week 17 schedule memorized. So I was targeting players for those matchups. And then with team builds, I usually commonly drafted two or three quarterbacks, about five or six running backs, seven or eight receivers, and then two or three tight ends. It all varied depending on how early I was taking my first quarterback or tight end. Same with running back and receiver. I also like have a lot of variation in how I drafted these teams. Like there's some teams I drafted with like four running backs and 10 receivers, but if I would draft like four running backs really early and then hammer 10 receivers late, just hoping I'll be able to find those spike weeks. A lot of fun with that is you can just have a lot of creativity with how you build your team if the best ball. There's no one right or wrong way to win. So looking at my average draft positions, I was actually mostly drafting either at the beginning of the draft, 1 through 3, or at the end of the draft, 10 through 12. The middle parts of the draft, like picks 4 through 8, I really didn't draft as much out of those slots, and it's just kind of the way the cookie crumbled for me. And then looking at team builds, I'd mentioned what I just said. Like 2-6-8-2 was my most common. So two quarterbacks, six running backs, eight receivers, and two tight ends. I do have a few fun ones in here. Like I drafted two quarterbacks, four running backs, 10 receivers, and two tight ends a couple times. But yeah, for the most part, I mostly stuck to that like cookie cutter, two or three quarterbacks, five or six running backs, seven or eight receivers, and then two or three tight ends. And then the teams I was most commonly drafting from, I was mostly trying to target good offenses and avoiding ones I was expecting to be bad. So the offense I drafted the most from was the Buffalo Bills, which I'm sure is a shock to the people listening to this. The Colts were actually my second most drafted offense, which I was really shocked to see when I was pulling the data for this. Ravens, Chargers, Lions, Packers, Patriots were also higher than I expected. And then 49ers were among my most drafted offenses. And then my least drafted offense was the Dallas Cowboys, which really shocked me. But I think a lot of that's because I wasn't really drafting Javonte Williams a ton. I was mostly fading him because most of these drafts were happening in June and July, I would say. And I wasn't that confident that he would be getting a bell cow role. And I was just mostly avoiding that running back room altogether just because of how ambiguous it was. I didn't want to be striking out on players who I wasn't sure were going to get a ton of playing time. I also, like I said, didn't draft from those middle spots too often. So I wasn't getting CeeDee Lamb as often as I would have liked. And generally, when you draft CeeDee Lamb, you try and draft George Pickens as well, and then also try and draft Dak Prescott. So if you're missing one of those guys from the jump, you're probably missing out on a lot of players from that same team. Other offenses I didn't draft a ton from were Pittsburgh, Tennessee, New Orleans, Miami, Jacksonville, and Houston. And then I have my most drafted players by position. I highly recommend just looking at this on YouTube because I'm not just going to go and just list off all these players. I will say with the quarterback position, my general strategy was there was a top four quarterbacks by ADP. It was Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson were one, two, and then Jaden Daniels and Jalen Hurts were three, four. They were pretty close in ADP. So my goal is if I either went after an elite quarterback or an elite tight end, but very rarely did I go after both, just because if I went after both, then I was missing out on really good value of high-end running backs and receivers. So that's mostly my general approach. And again, the quarterbacks that I drafted more so reflect which receivers did I take. Because if I took a receiver early, I'd want to pair their quarterback up with pair that quarterback later in the draft if I can. The only time you could really draft a quarterback first and then draft their receivers if you drafted Josh Allen or Lamar or even Jaden Daniels to some extent, but Jaden Daniels and McLaurin had pretty similar ADPs at the 3-4 turn. So who are my most drafted quarterbacks? It was Kyler Murray, CJ Stroud, Justin Herbert, Justin Fields, and Jordan Love, and then Josh Allen were my most drafted quarterbacks. So I wouldn't read too much into who these quarterbacks are. It's more so I was drafting them to be paired with the running backs and receivers. Or not running backs, the receivers and tight ends on those teams. My most drafted running backs were Ray Davis, Zach Charbonnet, Roshan Johnson, Devon Achane, Breece Hall, and Tyrone Tracy. So just walking through and talking through each of those. Ray Davis was my most drafted. Big reason why was he was going in like the 14th round. And at that price, the odds of him being the RB1 at the time with a potential James Cook holdout or trade seemed pretty good. The Bills have a good offense. Ray Davis just kind of was one of those guys who was like one of my guys during this draft cycle that I wanted a lot of exposure to. Because even when he filled in for James Cook last year, he was really good in those spot starts. Wanted to make sure I would capture that just in case. Another one is Zach Charbonnet. I drafted a ton. I want to say he was usually going around the 10th or 11th round. I want to say he was around RB 40. And again, similar reason as Ray Davis. The weeks where K9's been out, he's been a bell cow. And when you're drafting backup running backs, that's kind of what you're hoping for. Roshan Johnson's up there. Again, I did most of these drafts in June and July. Kyle Monongai was a seventh round rookie. I had pretty low expectations on what Kyle Monongai might be. So I was drafting a shit ton of Roshan Johnson. That's kind of looking bad right now. I wonder if it would have looked so bad if he didn't miss all of training camp with that foot injury, but I'll never know. But yeah, that one's looking like an L on my part. Achan, I'm sure is a shock to many of you. I mean, I think he has league winning upside is because of his elite prowess as a pass catcher. That's usually the kind of backs that I've gone after, and I've been pretty open about that. Achan was usually going around the 1-2 turn, so whenever I was picking at the end of the first round, like Achan was usually my target. The other running backs going in that range were Derrick Henry and Ashton Genty, and I just have a little bit more trust in Achan than I do in those two guys. Breece Hall is another one I drafted often. Breece Hall is probably on a lot of my teams with Achan because Breece Hall is usually going in the late third with these. And then his ADP was dropping into like the fourth and sometimes even the fifth round as the summer went on, when people were just being fear-mongered about Braylon Allen all offseason. So I got a lot of Breece Hall. I'm sure that's, again, shocker to you guys because I like pass catching running backs. Tyrone Tracy was another one I drafted often. He was usually going around that RB 30 range, and he was someone I was pretty comfortable taking. Just because even if him and Scott he lost some playing time to Scatabo, I had a feeling like he might still have some value as a pass catcher. So I drafted a lot of Tyrone Tracy. So yeah, next one's up on the list were Aaron Jones and Jerome Ford, which again, I like pass catching backs. Some other players that I want to call out that I was higher on than the 8% average. Travion Henderson. He was like a sixth, seventh round pick in the early parts of this draft cycle. I was drafting him a lot at that value. Once he was starting to steam up into the third and fourth rounds, I was kind of out on him at that cost. But I really liked him before he was getting steamed up. Another one's Amari and Hampton. He was a fourth, fifth round kind of guy at the beginning when I was doing this. And then he was starting to get steamed up to about the 2-3 turn by the end of the draft cycle when Najee had that fireworks incident. Wasn't drafting Hampton as much at that point, but he was another one I was pretty in on at first. Oh, another one I want to call out was I have 10% J.K. Dobbins. So I'm a little overweight on him. And the big thing with Dobbins was he was unsigned for most of the draft season I was doing, or not most, but a good part of draft season with this. And he was someone I was taking very late in drafts. It's just kind of like a free pick, hoping that he'll sign somewhere and end up with a pretty good role. So yeah, those are my most drafted running backs. Yeah, again, recommend looking on YouTube because you'll see the full list of my most drafted. And if there's anyone on this list that you don't see and you're asking how much I drafted them, happy to text and talk about it. My most drafted receivers. My most drafted receiver was Rashad Bateman at 23%, and then Khalil Shakir and QJ, Quinn Johnston at 22%. Wan'Dale Robinson and Jaden Reed are both at 20%. And then Trey Harris, Chris Olave, Josh Downs, and Jalen Coker were all 18%. Nico Collins, Zay Flowers, Keenan Allen were all 17%. Those are kind of the main ones I was going to highlight. So Rashad Bateman was usually going around wide receiver 50. And whenever I drafted Lamar, I pretty much always try to get Rashad Bateman. Rashad Bateman was actually pretty good last year at wide receiver 36. Like I said, I kind of like those boom bust players. And then so I was targeting Rashad Bateman quite a bit. Same with Khalil Shakir. He's not really that boom bust. He's actually more consistent week to week. But every time I drafted Josh Allen, I tried to make sure to get Khalil Shakir on my team because he was the highest drafted pass catcher in these drafts. Quinn Johnston was tied with Shakir, but I actually have more entry fees with Quinn Johnston, it looks like. He was someone who was pretty much free in these drafts. I was able to get him in rounds like 15 to 18 often. And he was actually pretty good last year. I think he almost averaged, there was like 9.5 PPR, half PPR points per game. And this is all half PPR. And so I figured, I might as well take a chance. He's another like boom bust type receiver that I will happily capture those boom weeks. I drafted an okay amount of Vlad McConkey, but yeah, Quinn Johnson was just someone I was targeting because I was like, this guy is free, and what if he is good? Wan'Dale Robinson's another guy I was targeting just in case, like, what if the Giants' passing attack is good? That's someone I'll want on my team. Jaden Reed was someone I was drafting a lot. I know he's a bit of an analytics darling. My hope was that he would play more of a role. This was before I knew he was going to be injured going into the year when I was drafting him this much. So a bit of an L there. Trey Harris is a pretty big L for me. I mean, he still could be good by the end of the year. Again, I was going after a lot of these boom bust receivers. Trey Harris was someone I thought could be the Chargers number two at the time he was drafted. It seemed like maybe they've given up on QJ. Keenan Allen hadn't signed yet. So I thought there was a real runway where he could be a boom bust receiver in this Chargers offense, pair him with Herbert. Wasn't the case. Ended up drafting more of him than I probably should have in hindsight. And then Nico Collins is also one of my most drafted receivers. As you guys know, I love Nico Collins. A very common thing I did at these drafts was I would go Nico and Achane at the 1-2 turn, depending on where I ended up. That was a very common way I started drafts, and that's how I ended up with so much CJ Stroud was I would be able to get him with Nico Collins, and I was usually able to get Stroud if I drafted Collins. Very rarely was I unable to do that. Yeah, Keenan Allen was another pick that when he was unsigned, I was just taking just about every time I could because again, he's pretty much free. He's going to sign somewhere, and then like the Chargers ended up being the best case scenario for him. So Keenan Allen was someone I was drafting quite a bit. Some other names of note that I wanted to call out. I drafted a lot of Jamison Williams, which I drafted a lot of Goff because of GMO where Amon Ra, because I would try and get these guys on the same team. Garrett Wilson, I drafted quite a bit of. He was someone who was going in a pretty good range. He wasn't as overdrafted as he's been in previous years. So I ended up with a lot of Garrett Wilson. That's how I ended up with a lot of Justin Fields. Keon Coleman was someone I drafted quite a bit. I know you guys are like corn. I thought you hated Keon Coleman. And then I wouldn't want to start him in my weekly lineup. He seems like a bit of a headache to try and pick which weeks that you want to start him. But in a format like this where you just get his best games, I know he's very boom bust. That's kind of why I would want someone like Keon Coleman on these teams. Plus, I drafted a lot of Josh Allen. You have to draft Josh Allen before Keon Coleman. So if I had Allen, I'd be going after his pass catchers. Plus, there's always the like possibility of him just being the wide receiver one in Buffalo and could end up being a very valuable role. He's mostly been busting and booming after that week one, but he was someone I was targeting a lot in these drafts if I could, especially on those, mostly on those Josh Allen teams. Like Marvin Mims is someone else I was drafting often, again, because I think he's more of a boom bust player than anything. Yeah, those are mostly like the receivers I was going after. And then lastly, tight ends. My most drafted tight ends were Trey McBride, Hunter Henry, George Kittle, Kyle Pitts, Zach Ertz, Dalton Schultz, and Tucker Kraft. Trey McBride, he was usually going around the 2-3 turn. And I mean, I've pretty invested in the Kyler in this Dynasty League. I've been pretty invested in the Trey McBride. I think he's really good. I mean, I was drafting very little Marv. Like, I think I drafted Marv once because I just like couldn't stomach drafting him as early as he was still going. He was still going in like the mid third around like the Garrett Wilson range. And I would just rather have Garrett Wilson over Marv based on what they've shown so far. So yeah, Trey McBride was someone I drafted a ton. That's how I ended up with so much Kyler, was so I could have that Kyler McBride stack. I ended up drafting a lot of Michael Wilson late in drafts because he's their receiver two on the Cardinals, just to have another pass catcher for those boom weeks. That stack. Hunter Henry was usually going around tight end 20. He was someone who was felt pretty free. And if I was ever punting tight ends, like there was sometimes I would draft like three tight ends in the tight end 20 to 30 range and just hope one of them pops off for a touchdown each week. Hunter Henry was a lot of my main target there, or a lot of times if I had a two tight end build, I would try and get him as my backup because he was the Patriots leading receiver last year. He was someone I was actively targeting in these drafts, hoping I could get him. George Kittle is one of my highest drafted players. Again, I drafted a lot in the late third. He was usually going, yeah, he was usually late third at the 3-4 turn. Since I was drafting at the in slots 10 through 12 often, I was usually getting them either before the turn or after the 3-4 turn. Kyle Pitts was someone who was free in these drafts. He was usually going around the same points as Hunter Henry. And whether I was punting or just as a backup, it's like, well, Kyle Pitts offers some ceiling compared to a lot of these guys. I might as well go after Kyle Pitts. Zach Ertz, I drafted a decent amount of Gene Daniels. He's another one in like that tight end 20 range where I was just drafting a ton of them because it's like, well, he might score a bunch of touchdowns and what I was expecting to be a very good Commanders offense. Also drafted a good amount of Jaden Daniels, so I'd want that stack. Dalton Schultz was very highly drafted. Very similar reason why I was drafting him as Zach Ertz was he was a part of an offense I was hoping would be good. I drafted a lot of Nico Collins, a lot of CJ Stroud. I really didn't trust guys like Jalen Noel or Christian Kirk or Jaden Higgins a ton. And so Dalton Schultz was usually the second pass catcher I'd be drafting on these teams. Oh, I guess that's one more thing I forgot to mention. Usually with when I would have a quarterback receiver quarterback tight end stack, I'd usually go after two pass catchers on these teams. Sometimes I would do three, but I would never go more than three, just because then you lose a lot of I don't know what the right way to say it. Just like strategically, it just didn't make as much sense to go after more guys in the same offense because then you're starting to limit your upside a little bit on a weekly basis. And then Tucker Kraft is someone I drafted often. Again, I drafted so much Jaden Reed. And then Tucker Kraft and Love's ADP were very similar. So the goal was I would draft Jaden Reed and then try and get both Kraft and Love on those same teams. So yeah, those were my most drafted players in best ball. A little bit of overview of what best ball is and what strategies I was going over. I'd be happy to talk about more in depth with any of you who are interested in learning more or curious about how I'm viewing certain players going into the season. And with that, I am at time. Thank you all for listening to the GDFL podcast. Much love to all of you. Hope all of you have a great day, great week. Best of luck to all of you this week, and I will see you later.